Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on Django deployment on Linode. My name is Jose Portilla, and I'll be guiding you through the process of deploying a Django web application using Linode. I'm an instructor for topics like Python, data science, SQL, and web development, and I have over 2.6 million students on Udemy. In this particular video, which is part of a larger course, we're going to learn to deploy a Django web application using the super convenient Linode Marketplace. And you can check out the link below in the description to explore the actual full course that this video is a part of. In the full course, we'll teach you the full stack from front end to back end to deployment on Linode. So we'll take you through things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Bootstrap, Python, Django, all the way until this video where you're going to end up discovering how to take all that knowledge and actually deploy it to the web. Okay, let's get on with the deployment guide. Welcome everyone to this section of the course where we're going to focus on actually deploying our website to the internet so anyone can then visit your website. What we're going to do is just explore a couple of details that allow us to actually deploy our Django application. And I want to start off by thinking about what are the key requirements that we need when having our website up and running on the internet. Well, we first want to make sure that anyone can visit our website online, which means we don't want to concern ourselves with things like uptime or resiliency. So, for example, throughout this entire course, we've technically been hosting the website, but we've only hosted it locally and only let it be accessible locally. If you were a really good programmer and had really good internet and really robust resources in terms of servers and computers, you could technically host the website yourself. However, that's actually super complex, and pretty much if anything goes wrong with your local computer setup, then your website will be down. So clearly, we want to use some sort of cloud service provider. We also want to make sure that we're able to ourselves connect to that cloud server easily, and that cloud server supports things like Python and Django. The other part of this is that we need to be able to push updates to our code and have version control when we want to add new features to our website. So what we need to do is choose a cloud service provider. And that's essentially a company that's going to host a computer or server with our Django application living on it, along with the database. And I should point out there are many cloud service providers. There's AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Heroku, Linode, and there's often a trade-off between ease of use and price. And it doesn't really make sense for us to show an example through the dozens of cloud service providers. Instead, what we want to do is pick one that is ideal for someone who's just gone through this course and then wants to launch their website. And a cloud provider with a really nice balance between price and ease of use is Linode. And we can use Linode to set up an online server that contains our Django web application. And what's really nice about Linode is it actually has what's known as a Linode app marketplace that essentially allows us just to fill out a form, click a button, and immediately launch a Django project live to the web. It's super easy to use, and it's actually really affordable. Speaking of affordability, we actually provide you a link for $100 in Linode credit. And I should point out that what we do throughout this section of the course, depending on how long you run your website, shouldn't take up the full $100. Now let's talk about the fact that you will have to actually provide your credit card information, even with our link for the Linode credit. And you should note that any major cloud service provider is going to require your credit card information in case you go beyond the credit or free tier limits. And by continuing with this section of the course, you understand that you may be charged if you exceed the limits. And again, what we show in this lecture in this section of the course should easily fall within the $100 credit limit, but cloud services are going to be charging monthly, so eventually the credits will be used up. You can't just run this in perpetuity for free forever. Now, if you have any questions on pricing information or charging information, please contact your specific cloud hosting provider or check out your dashboard there. Us personally are not going to give you any advice regarding payments or credit limits. And if you ask a question saying, how much will this cost or how much will this charge me, we're pretty much going to have to redirect you to the cloud hosting provider and their dashboard there because we want to make sure that you get the most accurate information. So just keep that in mind. We can't really answer questions about pricing information. You'll have to explore those yourselves depending on your situation, the instance you end up running and creating, and your cloud hosting provider. Now that was the information on the cloud service provider. Remember, we also need version control for the actual code underlying our website. And we want a way to be able to edit our website's code and keep track of those changes. And for this, we're going to end up using a system called Git or GIT, and that keeps track of the actual versions of your software. So version 1, version 2, version 3, and so on. And we're going to end up using GitHub to actually store our code. So sometimes beginners are confused on this. Git is the actual open source version control system, and GitHub is technically a subsidiary of Microsoft, which allows you to, beyond a certain free tier, actually just host code for free. So we'll be using that, and then in turn, we'll be using Git to push and pull changes to our website. Now I want to quickly visualize our website hosting structure and version control structure so we understand everything that's going on. So we're essentially going to start up a server using Linode, and within that server, you can think of this as just a really small computer or a really large computer, depending on the actual instance you end up purchasing. And within that server, that little virtual computer, we end up creating our Django web application. This is essentially everything we've just did locally, except now we're doing it on a computer that's being hosted by Linode. And that way, the user browser can then ask the server, hey, show me this Django web application at this specific IP address, which you could later redirect to your own custom domain name. And again, we're using Linode for this aspect of the cloud service provider. Next, what we also want to do is make sure that we actually are able to update our code. So we set up what's known as a Git repository, which includes a copy of the website code that I can then make changes to, and when I'm ready to actually deploy those changes, I can connect them to the Django web application. This allows me to edit the code that's being hosted on GitHub without having to worry of breaking the website if I'm trying to test out new features. I can just mess around with what's being hosted on GitHub, and then when I feel it's ready after testing it locally, I can push it to the Django web app that lives on the server. And I should note that it's going to be slightly more complicated than what I show here. In order for our computer to actually connect to the server, we need to use what's known as an SSH connection. And we'll talk about that later on when we actually deploy our Django app using the Linode marketplace. But just keep that in mind. There is going to be a special secure connection that we can make to our server in order to actually edit things that are happening on that server rather than just viewing the actual website. Okay, so we're going to start off by setting up our Django web application using what's known as Linode's Marketplace. I think you're really going to like how easy it is to use. And this will do, again, a lot of setup work for us automatically. It's actually going to automatically start a new Django project and link it to an IP address on the web at a port. So what's super cool about this is pretty much in like a few minutes, you're going to have a Django project already set up live on the web that you can visit from anybody's browser. It's super cool, so I'm excited to get started on it. All right, so upon logging into Linode, you should be at cloud.linode.com. By default, it takes you to the Linode's page where you can actually set up your own Linode, which is essentially a little server. But what we want to do is check out the marketplace. So click on the marketplace, and then it's going to give you a list of quote unquote applications. So you can see here there are a ton of them. There's things like setting up a video game server, like a CSGO server. There's things like setting up a discourse server. And what we want is the Django option. So click on Django. Essentially what this does is it takes care of a lot of the heavy lifting of making sure your Django website, that is the project, is actually started automatically for you. And then it also makes sure that your settings are configured in a way that it's going to point to the eventual IP address that we're going to create. So select Django and then continue to scroll down here. And then you need the Django options. You can think of this as the super user options. So we need to create a Django user, a Django password for that user, and then a user email in case we need to reset that password. And you should really either know these usernames or passwords well, or just write them down somewhere. These are kind of really hard to reset if you mess any of these up. So I'm going to create a Django user. We'll call it my Django user. I'll set up a password, and then I'll pass in an email. Then once you've done that, you can select an image. This is essentially the operating system that's going to be connected to the actual server. The default Debian 10 is actually the only option, I believe, at this point in time. So yeah, so we'll just leave that as a default. That's pretty much exactly what we want anyways. And then it's up to you to select a region. You can use the speed test page to figure out the closest region to you and which one's the fastest to connect. but sometimes you want to keep in mind of who your target audience is. For example, I can select regions that are actually in Europe or Asia Pacific. If for some reason, maybe you're located in London, but you expect everybody using your site to be in Japan, it would probably make sense to set up this little instance in Tokyo instead of London. So honestly, there should pretty much be all okay, and I would just recommend if you're stuck here, just choose the one that's closest to you. So I believe for me, it's probably Dallas, Texas that's closest to me. And then what we're going to do here is choose a Linode plan. There's many different types of Linode plans. There's a dedicated CPU, which is good for kind of a full duty workload where really consistent performance is important to you and you expect a lot of people to be visiting your site and giving it a heavier load. You can also use shared CPU. This is going to be cheaper. And honestly, if you're just starting out and your website is kind of just your own little portfolio site, this should be totally okay. If you're doing things like a lot of analysis, maybe some sort of CPU intensive and RAM intensive jobs, you could go with a high memory instance that has a lot more RAM. Again, this really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, the more compute power, the more it's going to cost. So I'm going to go with shared CPU, and let's just choose a little 2 GB instance. We're not going to do anything too crazy here. You'll notice it gives you 2 GB of RAM, so not a whole lot, but enough to just launch a very basic website. And then storage, it gives you 50 GB of storage, which should be enough for just a very basic website, depending on how big your database is. And remember that database, the way we're setting it up here, is going to live within these 50 GB, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so this costs us $10 a month, which means our $100 credit would last us 10 months, not too bad, almost a year. And you can just leave the default label. If you want, you can add a tag, that's totally okay. And then we're also going to want to make sure we have a root password. So let's pass in a root password. And for right now, everything else is optional. We'll talk about how to SSH into the actual instance later on. So once that's set up, you can go ahead and double check everything, but you see it here, the summary. I'm setting up in Dallas, Texas, a little Debian 10 instance, just a little computer, 2 GB of RAM, 50 GB of storage, and 1 CPU for $10 a month. Then I hit Create Linode. And then upon hitting that, it should eventually refresh and take you to another screen here. Okay, so it will take a couple of minutes to provision this, but something to keep in mind here is there is an IP address. So what I'm going to do is essentially fast forward in time until this is done provisioning our instance for us. So maybe right now, if you're doing this along with me, go get a cup of coffee or get some water or just take a little break and come back to this in a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to fast forward in time now. All right, so I fast forward in time, took just a couple of minutes for me to get this one up and running. And what we can do is we can see the full summary, and we'll talk about how to securely access using SSH in just a second. But what I want to point out to you is the fact that this is running at this IP address. So we already know that this Linode is essentially a computer somewhere in Dallas, Texas, at this IP address. In the same way that your computer was running a Django application locally at 127.0.0.1 port 8000, this is now running a Django website for us at this IP address, and we already know the default port is going to be port 8000. So go ahead and copy this IP address and then paste it into your browser as so, and then say port 8000. Just like you would do when you were running this locally, except now it's at this specific IP address. Keep in mind your IP address is going to be different than mine, obviously. So hit enter. And if everything worked, you should see this little Django application running. So note here, this install worked successfully, congratulations. And right now, by default, we have debug equal to true, which we can then later on go into our settings.py file and change. Okay, so we haven't configured any URLs, everything's default, but we now have a computer in Dallas, Texas running this little micro website for us, which is running a Django website. Now the question is, what happens when I actually want to begin editing these files and playing around and messing around with my website? Well, this is where we have to understand how to securely access our actual instance. So SSH, or Secure Shell, allows us to securely connect to the Linode server that's hosting our Django project. And we don't just want anybody to be able to visit this computer and start editing our Django project files without permission. So what we do is we use an SSH, or Secure Shell connection, which is going to require the password you set up during the Linode setup process in the previous lecture. That's why it's so important to remember that password in order to actually connect to the actual Linode later on. Now keep in mind, SSH can actually be really intimidating for first-time users, but in reality, it's pretty simple. It's just a way of connecting your computer to another computer through the internet securely. All we need to actually do is just say, hey, I want to connect to this computer at this IP address, and then in order to confirm permission, you pass in the password, thus the secure shell. And what we end up resulting in is having an actual shell or terminal access to the computer that is right now for us living in Dallas, Texas. Now, once we connect through SSH, we're going to again have access to the Debian Linux shell that's located at the Linode server, which allows us to then use Linux commands at the terminal for installations and setups, much like we have access to our local command line. Now, a couple of important notes. Linode itself actually provides really great documentation on connecting on Linode through SSH. So in case you're actually interested in that, you can just go to linode.com/docs/guides, and there's multiple guides, whether you're on PuTTY, Linux, Windows, Mac OS. Essentially, just go to guides, connect to server over SSH on, and then Mac, Windows, and there's actually a little drop-down that allows you to select for different operating systems, in case you want a more step-by-step written guide. Okay. So if you're a Mac OS or Linux user, you have a little more luck in this because this is already coming with the ability to connect through SSH. And essentially all you need to do is copy and paste the SSH command from the Linode panel at the terminal, which if you remember, it was right next to the IP address information. And there's essentially two parts of this. There's SSH, which is the actual command line prompt saying, hey, I want to securely connect to a shell. And then you say, I want to do it at the root node at this IP address. Obviously, your IP address is going to be different than mine. And then once you do that, it may ask you a question of, are you sure you want to connect? I can't verify the fingerprint. That's essentially your computer telling you, hey, are you sure this isn't some hacker that's telling you to visit this IP address? You're going to say, yes, it's okay. And then it'll ask you for the password. Now, if you're on Windows, it's going to be a little extra steps because Windows by default don't actually have SSH typically. So you can use the PowerShell to connect, but you actually have to first install the OpenSSH client, which is done through Manage Optional Features on Windows. So what we're going to do, because I'm on a Windows machine, and actually most people are usually on Windows machines, even though Mac OS is quite popular with programmers, the vast majority of users are actually still on Windows. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to quickly install the OpenSSH client on a Windows machine. That way we can get SSH access, and then all users can then follow along at the Debian terminal with the same commands. So if you're on Mac OS or Linux, you can check out that link I posted in the documentation, which pretty much just says copy and paste that SSH command from the Linode panel and you're good to go. If you're on Windows, I'll walk you through those extra steps now. Okay, let me head to my computer. All right, so here I am inside Visual Studio Code. Remember, we can hit Terminal to create a new terminal, and the default terminal should be PowerShell. Remember, you can always hit here on this little drop-down arrow and open up a new PowerShell instance. Now, if you are on a Mac OS or Linux computer, you should have been able to just open up your terminal. It would have just been a normal terminal, not a Windows PowerShell. And then all you need to do is come again to your Linode page here, and then just copy and paste the SSH access. So you just need to copy this command. So make sure it's copied. Come here, then you should be able to just right click and or copy paste, and you have it here. Basically what this is saying is SSH or securely connect using shell to this root node at this IP address. Then you can hit enter. And if you're on Mac OS or Linux, that should have worked for you. Right now you can see on my Windows computer, it says it doesn't actually recognize the term as some sort of command or function. So what we need to do is make sure that we're at the correct location inside of PowerShell to actually run this command, SSH, and that we have our OpenSSH client installed. As a quick note, as I mentioned in the slides, there's actually directions step by step on how to do this on Linode itself if you go to their guides on how to connect to a remote server over SSH. You can see here I'm specifically on Windows, but there's lots of drop-down options like Mac instructions or Linux instructions, etc. So what we're going to do is follow along with the Windows instructions, and what we have to do is check our Manage Optional Features on actual Windows. So click your Windows key and then check out Manage Optional Features. Click on Manage Optional Features and then check if you have the OpenSSH client already installed on your computer. If you do have it installed already, then you're good to go. If not, click on Add Feature here and then add OpenSSH client. you can see here I have OpenSSH client, and for good measure, we're also going to add and install OpenSSH server. So hit install there and let it install onto your computer. So you have OpenSSH client and OpenSSH server. Technically speaking, for what we're showing here, you'll only need the client. So if you have client all ready to go, that should be enough for our applications. Let's head back now to PowerShell. All right, now here I am back inside PowerShell. I'm going to make sure to actually restart a new instance of PowerShell so those changes take effect. I'll go ahead and delete this one, hit Terminal, hit New Terminal, and open up a fresh PowerShell. The other thing I want to do is actually cd into where OpenSSH is. So I can cd and then 2 dots to go back up a directory. You're going to want to go all the way back up to C drive. So cd dot dot, that goes back up a directory. cd dot dot, back up another directory. cd dot dot, so change directory back up, and now I'm on C drive. Next, what I want to do is go to under Windows System 32 where OpenSSH is. So we're going to cd into Windows, cd into System 32. You should be able to use tab to autocomplete these just in case you are having trouble finding them. And then after that, you can cd into OpenSSH. And it's actually SSH all capital there. Okay, so now you can see how I went back up the directory all the way to C and then went back down into OpenSSH. Now, if you copy and paste this command, you may still get an error. It's going to report something like, hey, PowerShell is not allowed to run this. So I'm going to actually show you what that error looks like. So if you hit this, it's going to say the same error as before, but then it'll also give you this nice suggestion saying that the command SSH wasn't found, but that specific command does exist in the current location. And it's asking us, hey, instead type out this in order to actually run the command. So we're going to run the exact same line of code, except now it's going to be ./SSH and then your actual IP address. So essentially, same thing here, except it's going to be back or ./SSH and then root at and then that particular IP address or whatever your IP address is. So I'm going to say ./SSH. So again, just to make it clear here, ./SSH. And then I'm going to paste in that root, hit enter, and now it's going to ask you, hey, it can't actually authenticate this. Are you sure? And then you're going to say yes to continue. And then it's going to ask you for the password. So I'm going to pass that in. Note the password is invisible. And then here we are. So now I have successfully connected through SSH onto my Linux server that's in Dallas, Texas. And essentially right now what I'm doing is I'm at the command line on that computer that's being hosted somewhere else. Now really the final step is to be able to store a copy of our code on GitHub, either publicly or privately, and then update our server's Django project code with any code we've updated on GitHub. Now keep in mind, in order to follow along, you will need to create a free GitHub account before continuing. Speaking of which, you should really have some experience with GitHub and Git before continuing on. So this lecture assumes some very basic knowledge of understanding what Git is actually used for and what GitHub is used for and its overall use for version control. If you really have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention the phrase GitHub or Git or even version control, I would highly recommend that before you continue on with this lecture, go ahead and just do the very basic Hello World tutorial that's on GitHub. It's going to teach you a lot of the ideas on why you would want to use Git and GitHub and version control, as well as the very basic commands to create a new repository, as well as push and pull changes to it. So if you've never done that sort of thing before, just take a little bit of time right now, go to this link or just Google search Hello World plus GitHub tutorial and go through that tutorial. It's pretty quick and it will explain why you would want to use GitHub and how to commit changes to some repository and then pull those changes to another server. Once you've done that, then you should be ready to go on actually connecting this Linode server to a GitHub repository that we create. So essentially the steps that we need to do is have that SSH connection to the Linode server, install Git on Linode, create a new GitHub repository on github.com, and then connect Linode Git repo to GitHub. And we will need to create a personal access token for that. Then we want to be able to connect to GitHub repo locally, that is on my local computer, and then I want to be able to push and pull changes from the local computer to GitHub and then GitHub to the Linode server. All right, so that's a lot of steps, but it's actually quite simple. A lot of it's just copy and pasting commands that GitHub tells us to do. So let's get started by confirming our SSH connection to the Linode server and then changing directory to where our Django app folder actually is. Let's get started. All right, here I am back at my terminal. I've already done the SSH connection to my Linode server. Next, what I want to do is I actually need to navigate to the Django application folder. So we haven't actually seen this yet, but by going through the Linode Marketplace, a Django project was already started for us. We confirmed that by visiting 8000 port on our actual IP address, but we haven't seen the actual files themselves. So what I could do is I could cd or change directory into /var/www. Hit enter. That's going to change directory into this particular list of subdirectories. And then if you hit ls for list, you should see the actual Django application. This is the actual Django project that is currently running. So what I can do is cd into Django app folder, hit enter, and then ls to list everything that's in this folder. And you should see a very basic project here. We have DB SQLite, Django app, and manage.py. And this is where the manage.py is actually being run. So essentially, Linode took care of a lot of work for us, and the Django app is actually already running. You can confirm this by typing the command ps aux, and you should see somewhere around here something being run by Python 3 manage.py run server at port 8000. So this is the actual line that's being run right now, but you can see a bunch of other stuff's been taken care of for us. So just keep that in mind. You won't need to worry about having to run Python manage.server. Now later on we can actually edit the settings.py and then restart things ourselves in case we need to. So I'm going to clear this screen. Okay, so right now I'm underneath Django app and I want to create a new GitHub repository here. In order to do that, I need to make sure I actually have installed Git. To do that on Linux, that's actually quite easy. You simply say apt-get space install space git or git. This is going to install Git onto our Linode server. So hit enter here. Notice for me, I actually already had it installed. For you, it's probably going to ask you if you want permissions to do it or not. It's going to ask for about like 38 megabytes of space. We have more than enough space for that, so go ahead and just hit yes, and then it should install it. And note here, I'm right now underneath the Django app. Okay, so we just installed Git, which means I have the capability to create a Git repository, but I want to make sure that I actually connect that to GitHub. That way I have a place online where I'm actually storing my files and making sure everything's working. So what you need to do now is go to github.com. So here I'm going to come to github.com, and when you're logged in, go ahead and create a new repository. Go ahead and pick out a repository name. If you need some inspiration, you can go ahead and choose the one they suggest for you. I'll just call this Django example Linode. And if you want this to be public or private, it's up to you. I believe right now GitHub, both public and private, are free for a single user. If you want multiple users on a private repo, that's actually when you need to begin paying GitHub/Microsoft. So I'll actually keep mine public so you guys can see it later. And then we could initialize this repository with a git ignore, readme, etc., but we'll actually add those on later on. So leave all these blank, and then I'm going to create a repository. So this will now create a new repository. And what's really cool about this is it actually has the instructions on how to create this new repository on the command line. Now, in order for this to work, we actually need to create what's known as a personal access token. The personal access token will essentially allow us to have a password that will allow the Linode server to push changes here to our example on GitHub. To do that, go ahead and open up a new tab and go to GitHub. And then hit at the top right, go to Settings. Scroll down until you see Developer Settings. Then go to Personal Access Tokens. Then you are going to click Generate New Token. You can go ahead and give yourself a note as far as what's this token for. So I'll say this is for lecture video Linode. You can also make this expiration for this token, so I can make this expire in 7 days, for example. But most importantly, I need to understand the scope of what a server with this token password is able to do. So I want whoever has this password token be able to have full control of private repositories. So select everything under repo, scroll down, and then hit generate token. And then go ahead and copy the token that's created for you. Keep in mind, you don't actually ever get to see this token again, so make sure you copy it and save it somewhere secure. So later on, you can do more research on maybe best ways of storing this permanently, some encrypted fashion, but just again, make sure you don't lose this, otherwise you'll have to recreate it again. So I just copy this, maybe open up a notepad somewhere and paste it there for safekeeping right now. So again, I can't really stress this enough. Make sure you copy this before you actually go to another page. So copy this and write this down on a quick notepad for right now to follow along with this example, because we will be copying and pasting something else in just a second. After this, once we leave this page, you will not be able to see this personal access token again, and there's nothing I can do to help you with that. Okay, so I just copied that, and now what we need to do is come back here, and then we're going to create a new repository on the command line. So go ahead and copy this set of commands. This is going to initiate a new repository, add a README file, commit it, and then it's eventually going to add this and push this to this Django example linode. So copy and paste these commands with that little copy button. Let's come back here, and then I'm going to right click to paste that all in, and then it's going to do a lot of configuration automatically for us. The very last line, it's going to say, hey, git push -u origin main. Go ahead and hit enter there. It's going to ask for your username on GitHub. Mine's Pyrian Data, and then it's going to ask for your password. Your password, that is the password token that you just created. So then go ahead and paste that in. It's going to be invisible. So I just pasted it in right now. I hit enter, and it should have been able to successfully push that to the Django example we saw. So now you should be able to come back to GitHub here and refresh this. And now you see your main branch. Now you may have noticed this just pushed the README file. It didn't push anything else. You actually want those Django project folders as well. So this is where your knowledge of git add and git commit would come in handy. If you haven't done that, make sure to do the Hello World tutorial. But what you should be able to do is essentially come back here and at the command line do something like git add space dot and then say git commit space dot. I'm actually committing everything. Later on, we probably want to ignore the actual DB SQLite. That's not something we want to be saving with Git. But right now, I'll just save it for the heck of it. And then we'll say git commit my second commit. Hit enter here. And now it's saving all those. Again, later on, we're going to want to ignore some of these, like these PyCache files in DB SQLite 3. So I can say git push. Hit enter, and every time you push here, it'll ask you for your username as well as that token password. So I'll go ahead and put that in, and there you have it. So now you come back to GitHub, refresh, and you can see you have everything here. The database, readme.md, manage.py, and the Django app. And now what you can do is make a local change and have that show up on the actual website. So let me go ahead and do that now. At this point, I would recommend downloading GitHub Desktop, which makes it super easy to actually download things locally. So I already have GitHub Desktop set up on my own. So I'm going to open that up real quick. All right, so if you haven't already, Google search GitHub Desktop and download this tool. It's super useful. Technically speaking, everything I'm showing you or about to show you, you could just do yourself at the command line, but it's just so much nicer with the desktop, this GitHub Desktop GUI, this graphical user interface, that I highly recommend it. So what we're going to do is go ahead and download this GitHub Desktop. I already have mine set up. Mine's going to look a little more complicated than yours just because I have a bunch of repositories connected to it, but the main idea will be the same. So eventually what you're going to see after you download GitHub Desktop is something that looks like this. My apologies for the super small font here, but I'll zoom in to hopefully make it easy to see. You're going to click on Add Clone Repository. We want to clone a repository, basically saying go to GitHub and clone a copy of the code I have there to be local here. So we're going to say clone repository, and then start searching on github.com for the repository you just created. Mine was called Django example Linode. And then what you need to do is decide the local path of where you want to save it. So for example, I'm going to choose to save it on my desktop underneath Django lectures. I'm going to select that folder. Okay, and then once you've selected that, notice it's highlighted. I've chosen the local path. Go ahead and hit clone. It's going to clone that actual repository locally. So I'm going to move this stuff out of the way. And this is also where I would recommend having two screens. It's very helpful. And then if you expand Explorer, you should see Django example Linode, Django app. Later on, we'll get rid of this DB SQLite. I don't want to be constantly pushing and pulling the entire database. That wouldn't make sense. So we want to add that to a git ignore file later on. Then we'll hit Django app, and I can see everything that I'm already familiar with. So let's keep this current PowerShell terminal open, and I'm going to add a new one, command prompt, which is now located here in Django Lectures. And let's create a very simple landing page and make sure everything is working. All right, so this should feel really familiar now. It's basically the environment you've been programming in. What we can do is cd into our Django example Linode, and let's actually create a really small application that just returns back an HTTP response for some extended URL. So what we can do here is just say Python manage.py start app, and let's call this app other. So we'll hit enter there, and we should see the other app created. So here I have Django app, and now I see other app, and let's actually now connect this to our overall Django application. So what we can do here is everything we've done before in the past. I'm going to create a new file under other called urls.py. And then what I can do here is just make a really simple view. So I'll go to views.py in other, and I'm going to say from django.http import HTTP response. So let's create a simple function-based view. So simple view takes in a request, and then simply going to return an HTTP response that says hello. Then we'll go to URLs, and we'll say from django.urls import path. And let's create our URL patterns list, as we've done many times before. And then we'll say here's path, and then I need to actually import that view. So we'll say from dot, or actually we can say from dot import views. That should be fine. Then we'll create this path just blank. So when you go to essentially our domain, in this case, it's going to be our IP numbers, port 8000/other would be this particular view. So blank here, and then we need to connect it to the actual view. So we'll say views dot, and then it's simple view there. Okay, if you want, you could give this a name, but just keep it super simple right now, essentially going all the way back to the very first Django lectures. So we have our URL patterns here. I still need to connect this particular URL pattern to the overall website. So we come to Django app, and actually, yeah, urls.py here. And we'll say from django.urls import path, comma, and then what we also want to do is say include. All right, and then after this, we're going to say path, and then say other /, and then we need to connect this as include, and we are going to include other.urls, essentially following the same convention we always have. All right, so we have other.urls connected to simple view, which itself is connected to /other, so it would actually be something like that, and then that connects to simple view, which should say hello. So then the question is, I need to now push these changes that I did locally to GitHub, and then from Linode, pull those changes from GitHub. So we can do this all, or at least this local stuff from our desktop. So now bring in, after you did all those changes that you now want to push to GitHub, bring in your little GitHub desktop tool, and it'll ask you, okay, do you want to push all those changes? That's going to be fine for us. So we'll say first local changes here, commit those to main, and then push them to the origin. Perfect. So now we are going to come back to our secure shell here, and we're still located under the GitHub repo. If you ever want to run these commands again, you will need to cd into this GitHub repo location, but then you should be able to say here, git pool, and it's going to pool all those changes we just made. Okay, perfect. So that just pulled in those changes from GitHub, and then now when you go to your actual Linode page, you should actually now see a 404 error. You should definitely not have debug when you actually launch your website on, so just a heads up there. You don't want your users to actually get a page that looks like this. So right now that's okay for us because we're just testing. Remember, you can always go to settings and turn debug false. And then we're going to say /other, and now I see hello. But notice the IP here. This is a real live website, and as long as I keep this running, anybody can just go to this website /other and see hello. And then later on, if you wanted to, you could connect this to your own domain name. But we did essentially most of the heavy lifting so far. There's still a bunch of little details to discuss, and I'll leave some articles as well as some lecture links for you in the next article lecture that are really useful. Things like setting up a git ignore, how to actually go through deployment, things like remember to set debug equal to false, that sort of thing. But really, the core of it is done. We were able to create a Linode server that's a computer somewhere sitting in Dallas, Texas. I was able to set up a GitHub repository, and then I was successfully able to link that computer in Dallas to wherever that GitHub repo is, somewhere hosted by Microsoft, and then to my local computer. So there's essentially, when you think about it, 3 little computers interacting with each other. There's my local computer pushing to GitHub, and then there's a Linode server pulling from GitHub. And all that works essentially magically, almost, to show hello on the internet. And that is how the web works. All right, that's the end of the video. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you just saw how awesome the Linode Marketplace is for easily deploying Django web applications. You can check out the link in the description below for access to the full course. Don't forget to subscribe for more great content like this.